Okay, well, we will get started with our December sheep and goat monthly webinar. So I want to welcome all of you here. Today we have Brett Taylor, excuse me, with the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and he will be talking about what we can start doing to gear up for lambing, especially on nutrition, health, and management. So Brett, I will let you get started.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here. I think this is the second time I've been invited to participate in the webinar, and so I'm grateful for that. And so when visiting with Melinda and talking about, what do we want to present in this round of the webinar, and I think we kind of jump back to where are we, at least for sheep. I know this is a small ruminant, but being from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, we'll be talking about sheep. But I think what we'll be talking about will be able to be applied to any livestock system that you have. And so the focus is, where are we at right now? Well, in the sheep production system, at least around our area, we are right in pregnancy. Some of us are lambing within the month. Some of us still have 3 months to go, so we're in the early stage of pregnancy. But how do we get? I mean, we know that we need to be getting ready. I mean, we manage our sheep for today for really an outcome of tomorrow. And so not too long down the road we're definitely going to be right in the middle of lambing. But before we get into this, I think this talk, what I want with the attendees on the group, it may be nothing cosmic that I'm going to share. Really, the goal of this talk is to get us to sit back and think, to encourage you to start at this point, view all the way into lambing, considering where can alterations need to be made? Do alterations need to be made? And really, it comes down to mitigating risk of disease. I think everything in our production, if our aim and our outcome is profitable production, disease is the main threat to that. So really, it comes down, whether it's through our nutrition strategies, whether it's through our management strategies, whether it's through our healthcare intervention strategies, it is all about mitigating the risk of disease. And just a reminder, and I think that the small ruminant industries are more prepared than a lot of industries for this, because limited use of antibiotics is something that I do see a lot of sheep producers have been practicing for some time. But we do need to realize that the indiscriminate and affordable use of antibiotics is really at an end, especially with the upcoming June, to where we will no longer see things like penicillin and oxytetracycline available freely at the farm store that maybe some of us were used to seeing in the past. But like I said, I think that I would assume that for the most part, the small ruminant industries have always been aiming towards minimizing the use of antibiotics. When I talk about affordable, it's not that these are out of our grasp. They'll have to be prescribed through a veterinarian, but anytime we enter something in through a chain, it's going to come at a higher cost. And so again, that makes us back up and decide, maybe we won't be using antibiotics for some of these things. So, but regardless of that or not, we always need to consider, in terms of alternative strategies or improvement of current strategies, that we use to mitigate the risk of disease. So that's what the encouragement is as we go through, and we'll hit on 3 topic areas, very specific areas that I encourage people to reconsider as you move through the pregnancy part, gestation with your ewes, and into lambing. One of the things is placing our focus. Really, when you look, and we'll visit about this term again, when we look at human health care, one of the original definitions that was established a long time ago, as far as what is healthcare? Well, healthcare really comes down to facilitating adaptation for at least the medical profession of their clients to their environment. For us, our clients are our flocks, are our sheep, our goats. And that is our responsibility as producers to facilitate that. And also the key thing is that we always need to be aware. I have to remind myself of this all the time, that our actions today in terms of our flock management is really for tomorrow's ewe. If we ever find ourselves spontaneously reacting to something that we see right before our eyes and only managing for that, most likely that was something that should have been done yesterday, last week, or a month ago. And because of failing to do that, we're seeing that outcome, and oftentimes that outcome is negative. So always just keep that in mind as we go through, that we feed for the ewe tomorrow, we do our healthcare strategies for the ewe tomorrow, and a week from now and a month from now, all the way into lambing. So also, as kind of a pre-part of this talk, is looking at causes of death. And this kind of also helps us focus on, when we evaluate our system, we realize that our system is our environment. There are some things in that environment that we cannot control, such as the impending storm that's around the corner. I can't control the climate, but I can introduce things in the environment to facilitate the animal's adaptation to that environment. Let's use, for example, bedding. Bedding would be something that I would add to the environment, that I can't control the weather, but I can provide something in that lambing environment that is a positive component of the ewe. But also realize that the things that we alter in the environment that we have control over, if we mismanage those, such as bedding can be a good thing, but soiled bedding that's just compacted with feces and urine and a lot of moisture, all of a sudden becomes a negative factor. So really, again, it's focused on what we can manage and what we can't. And so let's put that into context as we look at this graph. So this data right here is death from an aborted or a dead-born full-term fetus all the way up to a lamb of 14 days of age. And this is typical. These data were gathered from rangeland systems that pretty much they're on the range from anywhere from 6 to 11 months of the year. But they do lamb in a very confined shed management system, or a very close high animal populated area of a very controlled pasture with shelters or breaks or something like that. Now, what I want to focus on, let's start on the 45%. This is deaths that are abortions of full-term, dead at birth of full-term animals, and also maybe these animals come out with a fatal defect. First of all, I want to address the fatal defect, in that a lot of these could be genetic. They're basically out of our control with the immediate management of the pregnant ewe. I mean, maybe it's something that we would want to look back at breeding. But realize some of these defects are often fatal early in the stage of fetal development, and those are absorbed by the animal. But the focus is the bulk of these dead lambs that we see, abortions, dead at birth, a lot of these are due to factors that occurred during pregnancy, and factors that we had some ability to mitigate that particular risk. But we may have it could be a diet imbalance, it could be maybe a vaccination that we may have missed, that those animals are exposed to a particular pathogen that's common in that environment. Realize that a lot of these are due to things that we could be controlling right now, but maybe we missed that window, and therefore we're seeing the outcome. Also, we jump over to this 23%. This is just sheer management that's related to predation, exposure, starvation, ewe-induced trauma. Now, a lot of these things right here are not necessarily things that we can apply to the pregnant ewe. This is to the ewe that's just lamb, and more associated in your lambing environment. But go to the next one, the failure to thrive. A lot of the lambs that we see in terms of just the typical classification of failure to thrive are actually these same lambs that, okay, they weren't born dead, but they were born and they're really having issues, and they only make it a few days. Again, can be related back to measures or strategies that we could have employed during pregnancy or as far back as breeding, but we missed that window or failed to do so, and now we're reaping maybe a missed opportunity. So this is just kind of a nice graph to bring us into the realization of outcomes that could occur during lambing, because maybe of measures or something that we didn't do at this point in time to the pregnant ewe. So in today's talk, we may not hit the third category, but I'm going to touch on health, specifically vaccinations. We'll talk on nutrition. We'll talk about nutrient density of the diet, and hopefully we can get to management. If we can't, we'll just skim it real quick. I think when we get to that point, it'll make sense what we'll hit on and sum it up real quick. So again, and I stated this early, as we're looking at this is a polypay ewe lamb, and she's given birth to her first lamb, a little bit big, and that would have been a decision that we would have looked at maybe back in breeding, but really she's successfully given birth to that lamb. The ewe's got good condition, she looks great. And so All of that is a result of decisions and factors or decisions and strategies that we employed all the way back to breeding and all through pregnancy. And again, we're looking and taking on that responsibility of facilitating her to produce in the particular environment that we have for her. But to do that, one of the best strategies in terms of health is vaccination. And that is even more important today with removal and easy access to antibiotics that some of us, but very few of us, some of us are used to having. But even in the day when antibiotics could be bought cheaply and applied in the feed, they could apply, almost off-label and a little bit carelessly. A lot of people thinking, I've got to have that tool. It really came down to the fact that vaccination still was the optimal and the most important tool in terms of reducing risk of disease outbreaks in our particular flocks. So when we look at some of the vaccinations, now this will be mostly relevant to flocks in the West, wool-based flocks, large range systems, but I don't think it's too much different. I mean, when we look at Clostridiums, they're everywhere. There's no place in the world that we can escape these particular organisms. However, some of these, and somebody may be looking at, well, if you're talking about the pregnant ewe, and these are vaccinations that we do in breeding in preparation for that ewe becoming pregnant, we see Corynebacterium here and a few other wool place facilities, and you're like, oh my goodness, what does that have to do with preparing that ewe in pregnancy in terms of the bacteria that results in caseous lymphadenitis? And these are these pustules that you'll see develop and during the shearing process are often spread from animal to animal. It's a real issue in some wool-based operations. But even though this is not a reproductively connected disease like Campylobacter, what we do see that Corynebacterium can cause issues throughout the body, and these pustules can be developed in a lot of areas that interfere with lactation, that interfere with intake. They can cause respiratory problems. So they can cause the ewe to suffer considerably during pregnancy, and then the lambs that are subsequently dependent upon her during the fetal development stage and on the ground as live birth lambs will not be able to thrive as well as those born to healthy ewe. But we do have our common one. This would be one of the most important ones that we're focusing on near time of breeding before and going into it, making sure that and the Campylobacter vaccines that they do have on the market today are relatively efficacious. And there are like Hygieia, there are companies that you obviously can get autogenous, those that are specific to your area. Some producers that are very near each other may work together to get an isolate to have their autogenous, a customized vaccine for their particular area. But those on the market and both the autogenous have proven to be very, very effective at managing Campylobacter and aborted outbreaks due to that. I have chlamydia here. We're starting to see a little bit an uptick in vaccination with chlamydia vaccines. And that is not necessarily, there are situations where you can see abortive outbreaks to chlamydia, but what we've seen over the years and through the region, that's relatively rare. What we are seeing though, and it is becoming a very significant problem that has been for some time, is that the chlamydia transfer, and there's specific species, and that would be another topic, but transfer to the neonatal lamb and joint eel being set up because of that particular organism. And this is very hard to treat. Joint eel in your lambs are very hard to treat. So some producers are looking way down the road, taking care of this animal for today for what's going to happen tomorrow, and looking way down to the road in terms of care for the neonatal lamb. For the gestating ewe, as we get in, again, we are implementing a strategy today to focus on the animal tomorrow, and that's the Clostridiums. They're everywhere. So these are going to be your enterotoxemias. It's going to pop up in these lambs. These are going to be the tetanus and all of those associated, even down to the really gnarly, nasty infections to where gangrene can set up. The different species of Clostridiums are gnarly little boogers and can cause grief. And what I'm going to show as we go past this slide is the beauty of customizing your the antibody cocktail in the ewe that's going to be pulled from the ewe to the colostrum and be given to that lamb. That lamb nurses that in the first 12 hours of its life, and how we can transfer and we can look what are the diseases that are most prominent in my system and my neighbor's system that I really need to be concerned about for those newborn lambs. Because realize in ruminant animals, a newborn ruminant animal does not have a functional immune system. They're not like us. They're not like our dogs, okay? Which when they're born, they have a functional immune system and they can actually do quite well whether they get their mother's colostrum or not. We want to make sure that colostrum happens for our children and for our dogs and other companion animals that we have, but those animals can survive fairly well. A ruminant animal, a sheep, sheep or a lamb, a calf, a kid, goat kid, they have to have that colostrum from their mother because some data shows that at least in sheep, there's a 70% chance of death if they fail to get this passive transfer. So again, this is a chance, an opportunity in the gestating ewe, in the pregnant ewe, to customize that antibody cocktail mixture that's going to show up in the colostrum against those organisms that you feel are most detrimental to your lamb flock. Now, when we look at the neonatal lamb, at least less than 14 days of age, not really looking into vaccination at this point, and that's a whole nother talk with why I say that. But we can look at things like enterotoxemia. We can look at things like infections, wounds, even some of the joint ill that's not associated with chlamydia. These are all examples of where the Clostridial organisms can rear their ugly heads. This is the environment that those lambs live in. So again, to facilitate the ability of my animals to adapt the environment that they're in, I have to find that environment, and what is most common off of that former chart I showed that results in possible lamb death is that I'm ensuring by working with the ewe today that that lamb tomorrow will be best fitted to deal with these particular diseases and organisms. And then as we get into the older lamb over than 14 days of age, I mean, although this talk is mainly on the pregnant ewe, still I need to be looking down the road and I need to have a plan to get those guys ready to go in terms of dealing with Clostridial organisms on their own. And I'll show you exactly how of that in just a minute. But I love this slide, and this is some research that we did, and I think maybe in one of the earlier talks I did about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, I presented this slide. But this slide, and of course, I kind of get nerdy in these areas because to me, the stuff is it's very fascinating, not just on the production system, but as a scientist. And this is a simple method to show the transfer, the passive transfer of maternal or the ewe's antibodies through the colostrum to the lamb. So this gives an example. So this is about 50 days before lambing. Lambing is day 0. And so we had a foreign protein. And so we're going to say, we'll just use Clostridium as an example. So they had their Clostridial vaccination right here. And then we followed up with a secondary. Now, again, I want to go back. And I get to be a little bit of a stickler on this, especially in lectures talking about vaccinations. We have primaries. That's the first exposure of you, your lambs, your dogs, whatever it may be, the first time they've been exposed to a specific type of vaccine for a certain pathogen. What that primary does is there is 1 or maybe 10 B cells in your body that just so happen to produce an antibody that will actually bind to that antigen that's associated with that organism. And we want to select for these, and I'm talking only 1 to 10, that's not very many out of billions of cells. We want to select for those guys. The primary allows the body to recruit those particular B cells, and they begin to proliferate. And then they begin to secrete antibodies. Some just go crazy and they expend their life just secreting a lot of antibodies, and that's where we measure these antibody titers in the serum. And then others go into a rest phase for the next time that we're exposed. And that's why we do this, the secondary, because in the secondary takes those ones in the rest phase, wakes them up, they begin to divide like crazy, and then we get this huge antibody response. And so that's how we lock in the specific B cells that we need to produce an antibody against that antigen. So here, just kind of watch the flow. We get this beautiful antibody response in the ewe's serum. It's way up here. But look, as we get right near birth, the antibody titer in the ewe's serum just plummets. And in fact, had I been collecting serum from that ewe out to about day 3 or day 2 after the lamb was born, what you would have seen is that this antibody titer would almost zeroed out. That's how efficient and how fabulous that system is in ruminant animals. There's a receptor, the original name was called the Brombale receptor, which was named after the scientist that discovered it, exists in the mammary gland. And it just sits there, and every time any antibody, the IgG antibodies come floating by in the blood, it just pulls them out and throws them in the colostrum. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a rapid depletion of antibodies in that ewe, and it's pulling it over to the colostrum. And this is the beauty of it. goes over the colostrum, that lamb is born and it nurses. And then boom, we're going to that high antibody titer, and the ewe now has been transferred through consumption of the colostrum and absorption through the gut. And this can only occur within the first 24 hours of life, the majority of it, in a transfer to the serum of the lamb. Now, when we look at the lamb, so remember, this antibody in the lamb is the identical antibody from the ewe and produced by the ewe. So it's the ewe's antibody now existing in the lamb. But as we see, as that lamb begins to grow, that lamb uses that antibody up. Those antibodies are out there grabbing the antigens that they're supposed to, attacking the organisms. In this case, we were using Clostridium as an example, and so they are expended and used up, and they begin to deplete over time. But at about day 7 to 14, the lamb, the calf, the kid begins to develop their own immune system to where they respond to the natural Clostridiums in the environment, begin to develop their own antibodies, or you begin a vaccination program at about day 14 to do the same in them as you did in the ewe earlier. And then you get an overlap of the antibodies from the colostrum with the development of the antibodies from the lamb itself. So basically, through your management and thinking down the road, is that we're able to make sure that these lambs are existing as they should be in that environment with the proper disease-fighting mechanisms that you've administered through your management procedures. So just kind of keep that in mind. And so when we're talking about, as we're wrapping up the health part, when we're talking about diseases and vaccines and health, again, I have to remind you, start looking down the road. Those that have been in sheep and goat production forever, still, you got to look down the road. What's new on the horizon? What's new in the area? Do I hear anything? You're visiting with your friends, you're visiting with the neighbors. It may be sometimes some springs, the climatic factors really bring on the right situation for pathogens just to go crazy. But you're thinking about that. Those that are new to small ruminants and production, that's, visit with them neighbors, visit with experienced producers, go to those meetings, associations such as the American Sheep Industry Association, they have materials that, they're totally available and easily understandable to pick up on what you do. And University Extension, don't forget about your University Extension as well as the veterinarian. The veterinarian, they're the ones that see, they have the office that sees everything that comes through. They have the phone that receives all calls from everybody that are having issues, and they should be more than happy to share with you what those organisms and diseases are that are most associated with your area, and what vaccines are obviously available that you can treat against. If they don't have a vaccine, then you're looking into your management style and what management procedures do you have that either promote exposure to a particular organism or management procedures that have been effective in and reducing the risk of exposure. Like I demonstrated in the graph before, consider timing when optimizing your vaccination strategy. That's very important. If I want a high antibody titer in the colostrum, I need to be near lambing. If I had given that booster 3 or 4 months before, there still would have been in that used serum some antibodies, but so much lower than what could be if I had altered the timing to be effective in terms of generating a high concentration of those antibodies in the colostrum. Anyway, so we talked about, the terminology. It's a primary and a secondary to alert that naive sheep or that naive animal to the first exposures to the vaccine. But then you have your annual booster. You can't forget about that annual booster. And so that's for the older animals that as a young animal, they had their primary and secondary. And now on an annual basis, if Campylobacter is important in your flock that you're managing, obviously the Clostridiums are important that we're trying to manage. And so we need to see those on some schedule. And that timing needs to be right before when you think that animal is going to be existing in an environment or a situation to where there'll be high exposure to those particular pathogens. Now, let's jump to nutrition, matching nutrient density. So there's a lot of deal about nutrition, just like there's a lot of things about health. For health, I picked vaccination specifically, nutrition for the pregnant ewe, and that's looking at nutrient density. So what do I mean about nutrient density? Well, first of all, let's talk about that we can introduce a lot of diseases that have really negative production or anti-productive effects in our flock through simply a mismanagement of our diet strategy during pregnancy, causing nutrient imbalances, and these nutrient imbalances can result in diseases. Really the top one's the primary common one. The other ones are a lot more rare, but they are the result of a nutrient imbalance. A lot of people, sometimes I used to think, well, as long as my animals aren't starving, everything's fine. Well, that's really not true. We may think that we have this beautiful diet. I mean, if we're growing our own feed, we may have harvested this feed at just the prime deal, and we're looking at, we could win state fair awards with this feed that we harvested. And so we have a lot of pride in that. Or we may have purchased something or some way to mix diets or whatever it may be, but we have to be real careful that just because it feels good and it looks good to us, we still have to sit down and ask the question, is this diet I'm providing to you, is it meeting her needs? Is it balanced? And will she be better off tomorrow than she is today? Some classical diseases that we see, again, are pregnancy toxemia, and that's one of the main ones we'll talk about, but we can see hypocalcemia, aka milk fever, vitamin D deficiency, and polioencephalomalacia, which these later two are very rare, but again, they are classic examples that my diet was off. And so let's jump into milk fever, and I'll show you as we relate this back to nutrient density. So most of us on the phone call understand pregnancy toxemia. We're dealing with a metabolic disorder due to energy deficiency. Basically, for sheep, cattle, goats, whatever it may be, it's the result of combining a state of very high energy demand, such as fetal growth at the last third of pregnancy, with diets low in energy. Now, think about this. You can have a beautiful looking diet, but it can be deficient in energy. And my point in saying that is that a diet that's all forage, all alfalfa, and we're going to use an all alfalfa diet as an example in the following slides, or an all grass hay. That grass hay could have been harvested at such a premium time. Again, it's state fair winning hay. But for that ewe, as she is ending her pregnancy, will fall short. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute in terms of meeting her energy demands. So when a ewe enters this particular state, in order to compensate for that low energy, the body begins to mobilize fat. And so this is where this particular disease or this metabolic disorder almost starts creating this vicious cycle. The further you go into it, the nastier it gets, because what it is, when we talk about deficiency of energy in the diet, we're talking about a deficiency of carbohydrates. And I won't get into the specific biochemistry because I even bore myself when I talk about the biochemistry, but these carbohydrates are basically complex sugars. It's sugar we're after. And the ewe, especially the ruminant female, this is a serious issue. And when they begin to mobilize fat to make up for that energy deficit from the diet, they create a situation that even requires a greater need for carbohydrates in the diet. So then it again feeds back, and it gets, again, to one of these vicious cycles that it's hard to dig out of. And those of us that have managed this issue in ewes realize it's a serious deal. It is hard to get the ewe to turn around. It's not like milk fever where you can just give a shot of calcium and they're up, or the vitamin B deficiency where you can just give a shot. And within minutes, you see a drastic difference. That's not this at all. And so as the examples that we're going to follow up on, also another side note is that, again, this is common in all forage diets. And if it's an all alfalfa diet, we have another problem, another nutrient imbalance. Alfalfa is incredibly high in protein for a forage, so much more protein than the animal needs. So when you or that sheep consumes too much protein, it can't assimilate that protein. What happens is it's going to break that protein down for energy. When it breaks that protein down for energy, then it's going to release nitrogen in a form that, if it's not controlled, it's going to be toxic to the animal. So the way the animal handles nitrogen overloads is it complexes it into urea, which is excreted out of the urine. Here's the trick. Urea is an energy requiring process. So again, you've added a third factor that even further increases the energy demand. You have the energy demand from the ewe growing a fetus. You now have the energy demand of mobilizing enormous amounts of fat tissue and being able to catabolize that properly. And now you had the added insult of having too much protein in the diet, which requires further energy. And so these all result in issues at lambing, premature birth, fetal death. We get loss of ability of ewes to nurse that offspring. So we have orphan lambs. These are all going to cause significant problems in our lambing enterprise. Now, you may say, well, Brett, I only see this issue, toxemia, I only see it on a few ewes a year. Okay. So think about this. If somebody shows up at work with the full clinical manifestation of flu, I mean, you can see it. I mean, it's symptomatic. They have all the symptoms. That person has the flu. Do you expect they're the only person that has the flu? If you really think about it, no. I mean, if they're showing up at work and they're talking to people, there are people that have subclinical expression of the flu. So the virus is going nuts in their body. It's really rampant, but they don't feel to that point, and they're not really suffering the symptoms that you can notice. They may be grouchy, just kind of looks like they kind of have an off day. It's affecting their performance. It's the same thing. When you see clinical manifestation of a lot of diseases, is that there are some in the flock that are suffering from a lower grade to the point you don't see the manifestation of that disease, but there may be some ewes that have subclinical toxemia, and they're also mobilizing extra fat. They're going through these processes. It could affect them. They may actually get over it and you never see it, but there was stress that was put on them. There was stress that was put on those lambs, and that is something that you're going to have to deal with, as the lambs are born and as you go forward. And also one of these things to think about, you may think, well, they made it through, they lamb, they're fine. But again, they're having to mobilize extra fat. If they didn't have to mobilize that fat, if you had a balanced diet, that fat, well, that could have been preserved and used well during milk production and making sure that they go on. So again, you're, if I'm doing a poor job feeding and balancing that diet, then I can, at least subclinically cause issues that are going to prove ill for the ewe and the lamb earlier. Sorry, I need to speed up. So I see the time clicking by. But now let's talk about nutrient density, and we'll see how something like toxemia will play into that. Now, this is a really busy graph. So the bars are daily weight change in terms of pounds of body weight change per day, and that's going to be on the left axis. On the right axis, it's dry matter intake, pounds a day. So this is just intake of feed. So the bars correspond, the lines correspond to the dry matter intake, and the bars correspond to the body weight change. The blue bars are ewes that are carrying a single fetus. The red bars are ewes that are carrying twin fetus. This model, which is based on real data, but a lot of data, basically makes the assumption that your open ewes right here are at a body condition score that's acceptable to moved into breeding. And so right now I'm feeding. The physical capacity for daily intake is basically matching here the level of maintenance. But as I move into breeding, I'm starting to feed, matching that physical capacity for intake, and I'm starting to feed in preparation for early gestation. So I'm on a positive body weight gain, okay, during that breeding period. Now we can see that as we move into early gestation, even at that earliest stage of gestation, we see that the twin-bearing ewe, that body weight change significantly responds. And so this goes back to a lot of people. The reason I like this data is, let's talk about milk production during lactation. Sometimes I'm like, man, I'm not seeing the milk production that I expected to have. The funny thing is that there are decisions that can be made back in breeding and early gestation that have an impact on the level of milk that your ewes produce 145 days later. So consider that, remember that, and think about that if you're having issues with milk, that was something that may have been addressed 5-6 months ago, and something that you need to be thinking about as you're moving into the next breeding season. But now let's go back to the graph. So now, if you look at the intake, the lines compared to the body weight change, what you see is you definitely see the twin-bearing ewes, or physical capacity for intake, suddenly increases of dry matter feed that they're consuming to match that increased body weight demand. And then when we go to late gestation, where the bulk of all fetal growth occurs, you can really see the sheer demand, a single and almost twice that we see for the ewe bearing twins. But notice something different here. Why didn't I get an increase in intake like I did in early gestation, here in late gestation. Why is this red line not way up here? Okay, again, these models are based upon really coming to physical capacity of that ewe to consume feed. So you have to think about that in terms that just like you can only eat so much in 24 hours, the ewe can only eat so much too. And so you can't expect the ewe to go beyond her capacity. And as you see that these fetuses develop in that uterus and it starts consuming more of that abdominal cavity, what you then begin to see is that rumen becomes even more restricted in its ability to expand based upon the amount of feed that you actually may want to consume an enormous amount of feed, but she physically can't. So this gets in of what we'll talk about in terms of nutrient density of the diet. So I'm going to take this red line here. This is the dry matter intake of the ewe, and we're going to carry it to the next slide. So this is that same line. And so here's the dry matter intake. But on the other axis, on the other side, on the left, that's energy requirement in terms of calories. And so this is a daily requirement. Now, what I did is I made these scales identical. So what that allows us to see is if this is the total pounds of dry matter intake that you consumes, the distance between here, and of course 0 is not on the graph, but if 0 was, the distance between here and here would be the percentage of that diet that needs, the percentage of this red lines that needs to be energy, available energy through digestion to that particular animal. So now as we follow these, and we're looking at the twin energy needs, so we're going to talk about the twin ewes only, is again, here's that line for the intake. And as we go through the different stages of breeding, early gestation, we can see that relatively the percentage of the diet that needs to be energy remains the same. But as we get into mid-gestation and late gestation to where that fetal growth just explodes, mammary gland development explodes, all of those factors that go into parturition, when that lamb is going to be born and starts nursing, the energy demand increases greatly. But again, that phenomenon we was talking about on the previous slide, the intake can't respond accordingly because of physical capacity. So if you think about this in terms of a diet, again, you can see that now the daily intake, this red line, has to be providing an enormous amount of energy because these lines being close together versus over here. So it's just like this. It's when if I have a cup and I scoop a cup of feed, the cup is all I'm allowed to have. And so it's a matter of looking inside that cup and seeing, is that all forage, or do I have maybe something like grain in that cup? The total volume, I can't exceed it. I have to stay within the confines of the cup. Is there grain in there to where that's much more energy? So that's increasing the energy density of the diet. Again, using the cup example, it would be like a glass of water and a glass of Coke. Okay, so I know that Coke, too much Coke is unhealthy, but really when you look at Coke, it's full of a very nutritious product, which is called glucose. Problem is we overconsume it. But really, when you look at the nutrient density of that volume, the Coke is much more nutrient dense than the water, which has no nutrition other than the value of water itself. So that's kind of what we're talking about, where we compare the nutrient density of the diet. Now let's move into an example. So I talked about providing a feed example, and we're going to use alfalfa. So let's use the alfalfa that you just dream of, and it's cut in the prime stage, huge leaves, and you just can't find any alfalfa better. And some of the highest digestible alfalfa that you can find, and really the highest digestible alfalfa you can find, is not really that digestible compared to something like a grain like barley or oats. But nevertheless, this is the energy. So this is taking the daily physical capacity for that intake and multiplying it times the energy that can be provided from alfalfa. So the green line is the total energy that's provided based on the intake of that ewe. And so what you see is yeah, during the open and breeding and even early lactation, alfalfa is definitely meeting that nutrient need. The alfalfa is definitely providing what that animal needs. But when we get to mid-lactation and we get to late gestation, even moving into early lactation, we can see that the alfalfa falls way short. Anytime what it's providing falls right in line with the animal need, you are flirting with the point of getting those nutrient imbalances to get some of those metabolic disorders that can cause problem in our flock. Even the subclinical levels, that can reduce the performance of our animals and impair the health of our ewes. Remember that example I talked about on the high protein content and what the body has to do to get rid of the excess protein? It requires energy. If I'd actually adjusted this model line according to compensate for the energy that's required to get rid of the excess nitrogen from the protein, this green line would actually slip down below the blue line, which would clearly show that a 100% alfalfa diet is not going to provide the energy that these animals need. Now, how do we fix that? And the deal is you don't have to have fancy equipment. It may be one of these deals to where you just harvest the hay, or you may have bought hay bales, and you have a very low input system. You're not spending a ton of money on feed mixers, which is great. And you're just putting blocks of alfalfa hay out there for them to consume. We can deal with that. We have a strategy. Now, here's the strategy. I went ahead and used corn, but you could use oats, you could use barley, whatever grain. You can even use, there's a number of byproducts. And we can even talk about highly digestible fibers that would work. And that's something we can address in the Q&A because I see I'm running out of time here. But this example, and this is the brown line, so the green line is still the alfalfa. The brown line here is where I simply just gave them a pound of corn a day. About 25% of their daily intake was substituted with corn. And what you can see is that just the corn alone, and it could have been barley, it could have been, heck, a highly digestible fiber like sugar beet pulp, would have done the same thing, to where we raise now the energy provided that diet is distinctly higher than the energy need of the animals. So we're getting in the area, back in the safe area, to where we have enough of the glucose precursors to enable the animal to do what the animal needs to do in terms of growing that fetus, developing the milk, and moving on into peak lactation after the lamb is born. So just something to think about. Very simple to do, and something we need to consider in terms of looking at nutrient density and why nutrient density is so important. And so our nutrient density, our diet needs to be, the nutrient content needs to be enough to meet all nutrient requirements. Also, for you guys and gals that mix your diets, you have a TMR, total mixed ration type deal. The composition of your diet, because a lot of times when we have a mixed ration, we're feeding on a limit fed basis. So we may not, it's not like having a hay bale out there to where they can consume all they want. We've got it dialed in. We know what their nutrition need is, and we're meeting that particular need, because remember, feed is your number one cost in your operation. So we're trying to be efficient. So the composition of that diet needs to allow for repeated bouts throughout the day. And let me give you an example, because if you have this, 3 or 4 ingredient ration, man, it's just awesome. It's wonderful, processed down to where the palatability is high. A ewe will consume 24 hours worth of feed, especially if it's nutrient dense, within 30 minutes. So what are they supposed to do for the other 23 and a half hours? They get to wool picking, they get fidgety. And then when you show up the next morning with your feed wagon, then you have ewes taking off, running for the bunk that are about to deliver their lambs. And there's some ewe laying there with triplets. She cannot physically get up fast enough, and she winds up being trampled to death. You would be amazed at how many times that I've seen this throughout operations. So what I can do is I can actually, even though I'm making a really nutrient dense diet, I can throw something in that diet that like 5 or 10% of the diet, maybe like barley straw or barley hay. That's barley straw, not barley hay, but barley straw or wheat straw. That's the aftermath after you harvest the grain. It's low digestibility. It's not that palatable, but sheep, cattle, they'll eat it. And it's something that when they go back to the bunk and everything's gone on the other diet, if I have this, they'll be like, well, I didn't like that, and I sorted through and didn't eat it this morning. But yeah, I'll eat it now. And so there's always something for them to chew and to ruminate on. And that's a very important part of a ruminant animal, is that they can ruminate. And so that's one of the ways, something that we can do today that's going to save you tomorrow. Also encourage consumption of less palatable fractions. A lot of times, remember, feed is your number one cost. This kind of gets away from the health of the animals, kind of gets into other factor. But you need to look at your diet, especially for you guys and gals that are mixing diets. Make sure you encourage consumption of those fractions are less palatable, because that is money. And don't forget, and just as important of anything, salt, minerals, vitamins, plenty of fresh water. And I want to dwell on this a little bit. We're not going to make it to the other part, but I want to close out with this and talk about the importance of plenty of fresh water. So as a particular study we've been running about 3 or 4 years, to where we've been monitoring water intake, because there was actually a test product in the water that was mixed in the water. And I mean, just on the side, we started collecting data because sometimes the water buckets were set up at a level that the ewes, I do not like water buckets on the ground, so I elevate mine and they're fixed so they can't be spilled. Still, there were some ewes that were tall enough that they could defecate every once in a while in these buckets. And one fecal pellet would discourage water consumption. And we were changing water every 12 hours. So it's not that we were leaving water in there for every 12 hours they got fresh water. But you couldn't believe how one pellet floating around that water reduced water intake for that ewe. And that ewe at the end of pregnancy and at the beginning of lactation needs to be consuming enormous amounts of water. And if that pellet had dissolved and kind of turned the water green, they almost wouldn't consume it at all. So you cannot believe how sensitive, just like we would. I mean, put yourself in their shoes. We wouldn't drink it, so why should we make them drink it? So plenty of fresh water, and really, when it comes down to it, water is, we're all water-based organisms, so water is the most important nutrient. So wrapping up with this, I'll just go to, what I was going to talk about, keeping the lambing grounds for the lambs, not the pathogens. Remember, when you get into your lambing situation, you are concentrating animals, whether you're shed lambing, pasture lambing, you're still concentrating the animals. You're creating an environment. You're trying to create an environment that your ewes can lamb safely and your lambs can survive. But at the same time, with the feces and the urine and the water, and then you pile weather factors on top of that, you are creating a primo environment for pathogen growth. So you need to be thinking about fresh bedding. You need to be about thinking of water drainage through your areas. We all need to be thinking about even applications of bactericides or things that are just small disinfectants that are relatively safe. There's a lot of contact disinfectants out there, meaning that when they hit it, they kill it, but then the disinfectant breaks down. They don't have much residual. There are a lot of opportunities that we need to think about in keeping those areas clean and free of those things that promote a high pathogen environment. So, Cameron, with that, I think I need to move to the Q&A because I am running out of time.
Well, I can give you a couple extra minutes if there's anything you really want to highlight, or we can just dive into some questions.
Well, let me just go back. Let me hit this slide. Right, there's two slides I want to hit. If you give me a couple minutes. So when we talk about the birthing ewe and the neonatal lambs, and as we're getting ready, we're setting up our lambing environment. We're thinking about now. Here's some things that I want to encourage people to think about. And it's kind of one of those things that some of y'all will be like, well, duh, I know that. Okay, well, that's good. I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but some of us, I talked about the issue with water and plenty of fresh water, but also, especially for people that are lambing in jugs. So you got one ewe per pen, or you may have 3 or 4 ewes per small pen. I do think that it is worth the effort to where you get your waters off the ground. You get them off the ground, you get them up. Also decrease defecation in the buckets, but also spilled water. Oh my goodness, spilled water will ruin a bedding area and a lambing area, especially if it happens over and over again and you're always managing. That's just something that it's taxing you, it's taxing your labor force. It's just problematic. So most of you maybe think, yeah, I totally got that. You don't need to explain that. But again, if you don't got it, think about it. The same thing with feed containers. How can we fix those feed containers to where when we have lambs or we have ewes in a tight environment that they're not always spilling that feed? Not only is it not efficient, and again, feed is your number one cost in your operations, but you're encouraging, you're going to have from time to time, depending on your intervals of refreshing bedding or cleaning the area, you've got this nutrition on the ground. And, the ewes can handle that level of contamination as that nutrition gets in that environment. But a lamb, as they get down and see that little corn, and I've seen lambs as, real vigorous lambs as much as 12 hours old, find a little piece of corn or a little pellet, maybe you have a pelleted diet, and they're already nibbling on it. And so they're inoculating themselves, and not with microorganisms that are probably not what you really want in them. The other stuff, we'll skip over that, but I do want to go and talk about orphan lambs. And it's never too early to talk about orphan lambs. This can be a disease catastrophe depending on how that you manage your orphan lamb component. You need to be looking at a plan. Remember that the best way to manage orphan lambs is to not orphan them. And you may be like, "What? Okay, I got that." No, really invest, people that if you don't, and I think most goat and sheep producers are automatic geniuses at cross fostering. But you may be talking to somebody that's getting new into the field. Man, you got to introduce the beautiful management strategy of cross fostering. If this ewe can't support that lamb, that ewe over there can, or that doe over there can, manage that kid. You get that over there and avoid the orphaning situation. But once you get into the orphaning, management of orphan lambs is a totally different ball game than just the lambs that are with the ewes. You are really getting into a situation to where pathogens can run rampant. And you need to be looking at good vaccination strategies. You need to be looking at good, clean facilities or areas or pens or ever how you manage that. And you need to know what that exit plan is. Are you just selling the orphans outright to the people around the area? Are you going to grow these orphans to certain level of production, maybe 60 pounds, or wean them off or take them all the way to finishing? You need to be thinking about strategies that's going to apply at the minute that lamb's born an orphan, strategies that need to be applied right then to ensure that you accomplish that goal in the end. And okay, with that, Aaron, I'll go to questions.
Okay, great. So the first question we had come in was, how does intranasal vaccine compare to injectable vaccine for coverage and effectiveness?
That I don't know. I've been visiting with a couple of Germany's really, looking, a few of the scientists over there are really going into that, and as far as looking at the data, I visited with them. They claim a decent efficacy, but I really don't know. But it would be so wonderful if we can get to that stage of everything being, I mean, it would be the dream come true.
So the next question was, what about using a tub that contains fat for late gestation?
Well, that's a good question. And I've really never thought about it that way. So again, I think it's going to depend, because if you're in a situation to where, now a lot of those tubs, and you're talking maybe like some of the crystallized, I assume that you're talking about some of the crystallized products, which will have a degree of fat in them, but they also have a degree of carbohydrate resources in there. And I think that those particular products would be possible as far as providing a decent level of nutrition, but realize the rate that the animals consume of that a day, that would just have to be monitored to see, does it really add that level of, because we're not after fat in these situations, we're after higher energy, and nutrient density is driven, at least in our diets, even though fat is a nutrient dense component. But we are in a situation where it's slightly a possible nutrient imbalance because of lack of carbohydrates. So as long as that particular block or that block product that they're consuming that has the fat crystallized in it or pressed in it, as long as there is some digestible components that contribute to the carbohydrate type compounds, then that's really about all I can comment on that. I still think in those situations though, and I appreciate the person asking the question. That was a very good question. I mean, you really had to make me think into it. Is really, making sure, and what diet are you feeding in the background that's supplemented with these particular blocks or these crystallized products. And again, if you step back and just see that carbohydrates is still a limiting factor, we still need to provide something in there to compensate for that.
So I'm gonna ask this question. It was just turned in, but it helps lead into another question. So the first question is, what do you mean by late gestation? How many days prior to birth does this term begin?
Yeah, I sit there and I just kind of divide it up into thirds, so if we're looking at, the last 50 or so, 45, really, when you look at fetal growth, you can see really in those probably last 40 days that you just see an explosion of that. I mean, it goes from relatively small to that, 8-pound lamb or whatever pound lamb, 9, heck, I've seen 14-pound lambs. And that really is occurring within of the large portion of it, not all of it, but a large portion of it's occurring in that last 45 days or 40 days. And so you can see that much tissue mass. Oh my goodness. really relate that back, plus the mammary gland. I mean, that's when you get the explosion of the mammary gland to coming into that, and then also the early stages of the colostrum and milk production. That all combined together, is what I'm tailing into those last, 40 days, 45 days is what I'm referring to is late gestation.
Okay. And so that kind of leads into this next question. They were saying there's a lot of information advising against overfeeding or boosting nutrients too much in that last trimester to avoid overly large kids and lambs. So they're asking, is this something someone would need to pay close attention to when aiming to keep up with nutrient requirements, but not overfeeding and causing those really large birth weights?
Yeah, so okay. So to answer this question, all I can do is go back to the data I've worked with and looked at lamb size. Really, a lot of the large lambs that we see, and I'm sorry, goat producers that are on, thank you for joining. Thank you for listening to me. I apologize for not being able to address y'all specifically, but I appreciate your patience with me. But sticking back to sheep, really, when we're looking at large birth weight, it's more of a genetic component that is with that particular sire or those particular traits that's contributing to that particular large growth. When you look at the capacity, the program capacity for that fetus as it grows to what the genetic potential allows, there is a particular limit to that sometimes an overnutrition state is not necessarily going to result in a problem with the fetus, but it'll more result in negative effects, digestive effects back with the ewe. But I'm just going about, I go through data of 2,500 lambs a year. And so since I've been here, we're talking about 40,000 chunks of data and looking at large lambs that had to be pulled, lambs that had delivery problems. Is it because of their large? Is that the problem, or is it because of other deals? And generally, when we see those really large lambs, it was more due to a genetic factor that we could trace down to sire or the type of sire that we used on that particular ewe. So that's about the best. Now, Carmen, Melinda, and some of those others on there, if you guys want to weigh in on any of these questions, because I'm just pulling from the data of 40,000 lambs. So
I think that's a pretty good data set to be able to make some knowledgeable recommendations on. This is something that I think a lot of us have heard in extension, people concerned with, oh, am I feeding too much, and that's why I'm having these dystocia problems and things like that. But I think, like you said, if you're not feeding enough, the dam or the female is going to suffer much more than probably the fetus.
No, I agree.
And that kind of leads into another question that I think is good. They're asking if there's a difference in feed requirements between breeds, or is it more dependent on ewe size?
Yeah, I mean, when the answer to the question is yes on both. I mean, generally, when we just look at breeds, let's talk about Katahdin versus Rambouillet. I mean, yeah, but when you're like, well, why is that? Really, it comes down to sheer mass of that particular animal, and so the Rambouillet is going to be a considerably. I mean, they have wool production that you have to worry about, but that's so little of the overall factor of what you're addressing. But really, you're looking at a larger animal is going to require that much more amount of nutrition to support its needs through all production stages of its life. And when you look, just to add on top of that, really, when you go to the nutrient requirements, it doesn't matter what what species you're looking at. When you go to the nutrient requirement books, a lot of those nutrient requirement books will break it down to small frame, large frame, medium frame. And so even on the modeling that we do to look at and calculate needs, we're really more concerned about the frame of that animal. If we're talking about the pregnant animal, we're talking about the number of fetuses in that frame.
So we have one more nutrition question. One final question that should be pretty simple to answer, and then we'll wrap this up. So the last nutrition question was, do you recommend cracking grains, oat, barley, or corn? Do you recommend having like a cracked grain or a whole grain?
Again, as all these questions have been a great question. So, not, and I'll try to keep it short, Carmen. Boy, this person, they hit on the questions that I could go on hours about, but we won't. So when you look at things like corn, oats, and barley, those, first of all, when we look at the way a ruminant animal handles feed and the way they consume feed and masticate that feed, regurgitate that feed, they're basically trying to reduce particle size. And the particle size has to be reduced down to a specific size that will fit through the orifice exiting the rumen to the other digestive components of the tract. So things like corn are way too big to go through. And so the animal simply will regurgitate that, chew that, and reduce that down. The nice thing about oats and barley is also they're almost too big, but the husk around that's associated with barley and oats allows that again, which also the husk is very nutritious, allows that to dwell in the rumen and be regurgitated and chewed down. Now wheat, and people just, if anybody ever thinks about feeding wheat, give me a call, I'll help you. Wheat can be incredibly dangerous to feed if you get carried away with it. But a wheat kernel is small enough and smooth enough that the animal can consume it and it will pass right out of the rumen into the digestive tract, and it really won't go through that process of fermentation, of regurgitating. So for wheat, we need to crack it, but it is extremely volatilely digestible, can result in digestive upsets. It can be fed very effectively, but I can help. And also grain sorghum is another one of them, that the berry of the grain sorghum is small enough that it doesn't hang around that rumen. So go back to the original question, barley, oats, and corn. No, you don't have to crack it. And a lot of people say, well, Brett, when I feed whole corn, when they regurgitate, I'll see it shoot out of their mouth. And sometimes it will, and they're like, that's wasted feed. That's true, and I'm not going to argue with it. But what you need to think about is how much energy are you expending or money are you spending to get that cracked? Because, we have a grain cracker here and it takes a 3-phase, 20 horse, of course, it's a big cracker, 20 horse motor that pulls an enormous amount of electricity. So it automatically raises the cost of that corn when I crack it, or the wheat, or the barley, or the oats that we talked about. All of those are completely digestible with the animal without cracking them. Do you get an increase in digestive efficiency if you crack them? Yes, you do, but you just need to make sure, does it justify paying the money to get the equipment to do that, to pay for the electricity, or to paying somebody else to do it? So that's my answer on that.
Yep, that's great. So this will be our last question, and then for anybody else that has questions, I'm sure Brett, if you send him an email, you can probably get to those.
Oh, sure. Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Yep. So the last one that I thought would be good for especially beginning producers is, when do you put a Scrapie's ear tag in the lamb for record keeping? At what point do you do that?
Well, the Scrapie tag is going to have to be done with anytime you are going to move that particular animal off your property, following your state rules, whether we're talking about intra or interstate travel, and meeting those guidelines. And so for most, that Scrapie tagging is going to occur at the event of sale or movement of that animal, to stay within the guidelines of those states for transport. And so, and the breeding animals is the key thing that this is going to be most associated with. And so that's the time when those Scrapie tags come in. Now, if on the other hand, you are genotyping your animals, so let's say you're doing flock 54, and so you have that information, well, that information can go right in your record keeping component, because that's what you have as your record. So you have your ear tag corresponding that this animal is homozygous, heterozygous, in terms of Scrapie negative, and that would go in your records. But really, it comes down to time of movement of those animals from your property to someone else, in accordance with the state and the federal intrastate system of meeting those requirements. So and also, since that was the last question, everybody, thank you. I know that this was just more of a discussion. I know that most of you already know a lot of this. I just wanted to provide it. It's things to think about. We're thinking about things today that are going to need to be taken care of tomorrow. And we don't want to have a party and we don't start cleaning the house and making all the party food when the guests start arriving. We want to have all that done in advance so we have a good party. So thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you for joining us today.